Good morning. Nice to see everyone at LibertyCon, and welcome to the debate on U.S. membership and support of NATO. As this has already been said, my name is Stephen Kent. I'm going to be your moderator today. We have two wonderful panelists to debate this motion. Warren Ray, you may also know him as Everyday Bastiat. Warren is an attorney in corporate law and well-known Twitch streamer. Also, she mentioned he was the winner of the 2021 Neoliberal Shill Award. Very important and prestigious. Peter St. Onge is a research fellow at the Thomas A. Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. The motion for today's debate is as follows. You heard it. Should the U.S. continue to support NATO or withdraw entirely? The format of this debate is going to be loose, gentlemen, beginning with 3-minute opening statements by each debater, followed by questions from myself, and then open debate and 1-minute closing statements by both Warren and Peter. I don't like over-policed debates, so crosstalk is welcome as long as it within reason. Otherwise, I will play traffic cop in that instance. Please do yield so that we can have a constructive dialogue. Now, NATO has been a relatively unquestioned arrangement in U.S. foreign policy for 7 decades. Formed in 1949 to promote Western security against the Soviet Union, NATO at its start had at least 2,000 miles between its member nations and Russia's border. Today, that number is closer to 0. If the goal of NATO is peace in Europe, and yet its growth, largely subsidized by the United States, is seen as provocative by our rivals, should the U.S. remain? Warren, kick us off. 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Great to be here today. Isolationism is a luxury belief for those Americans living blissfully ignorant what amounts to a continental empire surrounded by oceans and unthreatening neighbors. We have tried it more than once, and each time in our history, for our troubles of trying to stay out of the world's affairs, we have found ourselves at war after a period of unpreparedness and denial that has made the war that eventually came all the worse, all the deadlier, and all the more injurious to our liberties. We tried neutrality right after independence. We responded to British and French aggression by refusing to trade with either of them. And for our troubles, we had our sailors attacked, enslaved, and killed on the high seas, and were drawn into a war with Great Britain. After that, we tried neutrality in World War I, trading freely with all the nations of Europe as far as blockades and a war would allow. And we repeatedly called for peace, for negotiations. We repeatedly overlooked slights, aggressions, the deaths of American citizens, attacks, plots. And for all our trouble, we were again rewarded with more German attacks, threats to invade the southwestern United States with Mexican assistance, and drawn into war. After 100,000 dead, we won the war, but only through the establishment of, to deal with our unpreparedness, a massive administrative state that was necessary to prepare a slapdash army to send to Europe. After those 100,000 dead, the United States thought it was done and tried to stay out of the next European conflict, only to be rewarded for its efforts to both avoid war with Japan by allowing attacks by the Japanese on American forces in Asia, the USS Panay incident in 1937, for example. We responded by asking for no more than a cash indemnity and maybe an apology. For that, and for our overlooking of German aggression in the Atlantic, we ended up being drawn into the Second World War after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, again unprepared, again having to build a slapdash administrative state that again infringed on American freedom by leading to the highest tax rates in American history, and that again resulted in the creation of permanent taxation to deal with this massive need to generate funds on a real quick basis. The United States ended up taking the income tax, which at that point in time had been a class tax, and turning it into a mass tax that everybody had to pay. And of course, the tragedy of the internment of the Japanese, one of the greatest crimes in American history, was born out of the hysteria that came after America found itself at war once again fundamentally unprepared. This was not an American issue alone. The same thing happened in Great Britain, which tried splendid isolationism through the late British Empire up to the outbreak of World War I. It refused to engage in alliances. It refused to engage in planning. It refused to engage in deterrence. It thought its island station could save it. And when global war finally drew Britain into conflict, the English historian A.J.P. Taylor put it quite well when he described the station of Britain before 1914, saying, A sensible, law-abiding Englishman could pass through life and hardly notice the existence of the state beyond the post office and the policeman. He could live where he wanted and as he liked. He had no official number or identity card. He could travel abroad or leave his country forever without a passport or any sort of official permission.
Warren,
all of
please
that
wrap up.
was killed by the war. Because these countries refused to prepare and ended up having to engage in draconian, ridiculous measures that were then never undone and are still with us in large measure today. NATO is an alternative to this. NATO says instead of these slapdash measures to try and prevent war, instead of these slapdash measures that result from war, we can maintain lower tax rates, we can maintain more liberty by maintaining collective common defense, securing peace, protecting our freedom at less cost to ourselves monetarily and in terms of our freedom, and preserve peace against far greater foes ever since. Thank you.
Thank you, Warren. Peter.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, folks, for coming so early. I understand some people had a late night.
Use your microphone, Peter.
Great idea. Okay, you can probably hear me better. Okay, my position is that we should completely withdraw from NATO, give them some notice. Europeans need time to ramp up, train, buy equipment. Perhaps they'll buy the equipment we park in their countries for free. 3 or 4 years should do it, compact enough for a single presidency. But put them on notice immediately, make no fresh commitments. Ukraine, for example, is their mess. There are 3 reasons for this view. Number 1, we are unpaid mercenaries. Number 2, authoritarian blowback into this country that threatens fundamental human rights. Number 3, moral hazard that actually starts new wars. Going through them. Since World War II, we've lost 100,000 young men defending other countries who are infrequently thankful for it. Today, we spend $767 billion a year on defense. For perspective, the UK spends 54, Germany 50, France 42. And these are countries right next to Russia. We're way over here. It's their problem. They're plenty rich, yet we get to pay and die. Number 2, blowback. By getting involved in every place on Earth, we make enemies in every place on Earth. This leads to militarization of our own society, erosion of our human rights, defending democracy indeed. The Patriot Act is the most obvious example, but since World War II, we've built up CIA, NSA, FBI now. We have an alphabet soup of secret police, all because we bought enemies everywhere. We bought them very dearly. Number 3, moral hazard. In international relations, there's an idea that every war is a mistake, an error, because everybody should have known who would win the war ahead of time, in which case they would negotiate. Perhaps not fairly, but they would negotiate without firing a shot. That is not the situation where there's a gigantic lottery ticket called U.S. intervention. From Serbia assassinating Archduke Ferdinand to Zelensky flirting with NATO membership, U.S. intervention gives a carte blanche to bit players, bit dictators all over the world, gives them hope of running Hail Marys. Of course, that's not even getting into color revolutions that we actually admit to starting for some Baroque side quest required by our so-called alliances. In conclusion, alliances like NATO drain our country dry, they slaughter our boys, they turn us into an increasingly authoritarian society, and they can actually cause more wars in the world. NATO is a racket, and we are the mark.
Thank you to our 2 debaters. Before we do crosstalk, Warren described an unprepared slapdash world of foreign policy pre-World War II. To Peter, is institutionalized preparedness the only possible way that we can run our foreign policy in 2022?
You could argue for preparedness. I think both World War II is an extension of World War I. World War I largely occurred because of a series of commitments. So the UK was willing to give unlimited guarantees to various allies in Central Europe, in turn because it was hoping that the US would get involved. So I think that World War I is actually a terrible example of that. That was a case of our intervening. Wilson could only get so far because of public opinion as FDR, so they had to ease into it. But yes, preparedness is always a good thing, and we should encourage other countries to do lots of preparedness, to build up. The German military practices with broomsticks. Why? Because we do it all. So yes, absolutely encourage them by withdrawing from NATO.
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, I disagree with your history there. Great Britain tried to stay out of the First World War. It drew itself into the First World War because Germany violated Belgian neutrality in its invasion of France. The British said, we will intervene if you invade Belgium. The Germans did anyway, thinking the British wouldn't, despite their relatively clear point. There were no alliances on the part of the British before World War I. And the reason I raised that up is that there were some relations. There was some talk among some. There was no official alliance. That Triple Entente was not an alliance. It was an attempt to resolve other problems in the advance of the war, colonial problems with Russia and France, for example. The reason I bring up Britain and the reason I bring up World War I is that while entangling alliances were a continental issue, Britain and then later the United States, both the countries that, as I think liberty-minded people, we've got the most affection for in terms of where some of our political ideas come from, these countries had long-standing traditions of trying to stay away from institutionalized military preparedness, and the end result was that their responses to aggression ended up depriving them of a lot of freedom that didn't have to be lost in the nature of how they ended up having to respond to that threat. So that's one point I disagree on the history there. The other point I would say is, when you mentioned the 100,000 who have died in wars abroad, I would say that, 2 points to that. First of all, I would recognize that as the tragedy that it is. I would also recognize that before the NATO alliance and before America's commitment to kind of a permanent commitment to the international order, the United States lost 500,000 soldiers fighting in the First World War and the Second World War. And since then, there has been relative peace in Europe, and most of those 100,000 did not die in the areas where the first two global wars that drew America in came from. So NATO in its own theater has been remarkably successful in peace and preventing that. The final point I'd say is you mentioned moral hazard, and you mentioned the Patriot Act. And I would agree that the Patriot Act was a disaster, and a lot of America's response to 9/11 was an abject disaster. But it is worth remembering, as painful as it is for me as an American to say, that the Europeans, our NATO allies, warned us through much of this, saying, look, don't invade Iraq. Be circumspect with respect to Afghanistan. They weren't the ones pressuring us into the Patriot Act. We did that all on our own. So it is worth knowing that, it's worth remembering that these multilateral alliances help rein in America's tendencies sometimes, and they do not always, I would say, usually exacerbate them.
NATO giving us several weeks warning on 9/11 compared to the 50-year buildup of the police state complex, which was largely in result of the Cold War, which was very much the Russians, the Soviets. So no, foreign intervention, the pattern of it is that we end up importing authoritarianism. We do not defend our democracy, we lose it.
Now, I don't agree with that, because the United States, since that time, has, during the buildup of the Cold War, for example, and I raised World War I, World War II as examples of the alternative to this. During those periods of time, in those wars and the interwar period, we had increased taxation, increased government restrictions, all that culminated, again, as I mentioned, the disaster, the internment of the Japanese Americans. By contrast, during the Cold War, the United States started with a defense budget that was about 10%. At the end of World War II, it was about 25% of national income. In the peacetime period, it was 10% of national income. During the Eisenhower years, it went down almost every year as a percentage of national income to where now it's 3%. You are right that we spend, I think, something on the order of $700 billion a year, but we must think in relative terms as well, too. During this period of time, America's defense commitment as a share of GDP, as a share of scarce resources, has gone down, and by contrast, we've had less conflict of the scale that we're dealing with, for example, in the first half of the 20th century. None of it's threatened the United States as a country, and indeed has, I would argue, prevented such.
Peter, final note on this. Go ahead.
The question here is not whether the U.S. should have a military, which is a separate, interesting discussion. The question here is whether NATO participation in particular is causing trouble. I think it's very clear. NATO solves no problems for us. It gets us into lots of trouble. We see one of them right now with chatter of nuclear weapons. This is insane. For what? For Donbass? Why does the U.S. have an opinion who owns Donbass? They are two corrupt dictatorships, not our problem.
All right, I vehemently reject the framing of Ukraine as a corrupt dictatorship by every measure, by every independent organization. Even though Ukraine has problems as a democracy, particularly with corruption, it is nevertheless a democracy, and its people have struggled for quite some time to build a democracy. So
and I want to take us to modern times there. This is a good place to start.
I do want to say, I don't want to get lost in that point, because while that is an important point, I don't think that is the main point of what you were describing. The main point is the question of, okay, that's all well and good, Warren, but what's that done for us in terms of preventing conflict? Well, there are a few things it's done. First of all, you mentioned the Germans fighting with broomsticks. It reminds me of a comment made by one of the first British representatives, I believe his name was Lord Ismay, appointed by Winston Churchill as the representative of Great Britain to NATO. And he said that the main task of NATO was to keep the Americans in, to keep the Russians out, and to keep the Germans down. It is no small thing that Germany is now a peaceful democracy that is thoroughly wedded to the international order that we, the British, the French, all our allies in NATO share, that we are all on the same team as an incredible foreign policy achievement that has helped preserve the peace that, by contrast, before this period, had a country that engaged in wars, as Norm Macdonald famously pointed out, against the world twice, and came strangely close to winning. So it is worth remembering that first, it has, by its very nature, by putting people on the same team, helped preserve peace.
So your claim, so this was achieved by World War II. Okay, Germany was brought into our team in World War II. So your claim is that NATO specifically is what kept Germany a democratic nation?
I'm saying it's one element. It's not the only element, but the fact that there is no question, the fact that there is no plausible situation by which there could be any kind of military aggression between Germany and France or Poland, the fact that these countries are all now on the same team is an incredibly important asset. It means that because aggression is no longer even a plausible consideration, they can focus much more easily than they have been historically on economic development.
I want to talk about the team and whether or not we should grow it. So let's move to the current debate on the table, nation or worldwide. The old debate used to be whether or not NATO served a purpose because the Soviet Union was defunct, therefore, why even bother? The premise was always this, but Russia is no longer that. Things have changed, so instead I ask, should the alliance open its door to the applications from Bosnia, Herzegovina, Finland, Georgia, Sweden, and the Ukraine?
If we want more wars, absolutely. Bring everybody in so that we can participate in more wars and grow the military.
Well, I'd say, first of all, you mentioned Bosnia, Sweden, Finland, and was it Ukraine? Okay. So each of those would have to be taken on its own. For example, Bosnia is an interesting case to mention. I'm not sure right now Bosnia's status as an application NATO, but it's worth knowing that one of NATO's post-Cold War interventions was in the former Yugoslavia, and its first one was indeed in Bosnia-Herzegovina. And this was in response to the fact that the Serb army, an army backed by the state of Serbia, but which was comprised of the Serbs who lived in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Republika Srpska, as it is called, was engaging in what amounted to a war of conquest and eventually became a genocidal campaign in Bosnia-Herzegovina. NATO helped bring that to an end through a relatively limited but nevertheless successful bombing campaign, and the Dayton Accords that resulted from this have held for 25 years, and though Bosnia-Herzegovina certainly isn't perhaps my idea of a perfectly governed state, it is nevertheless partially a democracy. It is nevertheless a country that has had peace and no ethnic cleansing for the last 25 years since then.
And again, the question is not whether, say, the European Union should build its own military force and intervene in its local countries. That may well be the case. The point is, the U.S. has nothing to do with it. It ain't our fight.
So I will address that because I'm glad you mentioned that, because it is easy to get lost in this stuff and think, well, our things, the whole world is our interest, and I don't take that position. I think that often the interests overlap. Now, you are right to say, well, why don't the Europeans try? Well, first of all, it is always worth noting that in many great American efforts in Europe, they are always preceded by European efforts to resolve these issues. The European Council, before the European Union, tried to bring peace in Bosnia, and it failed. Through its negotiations, it failed to provide any kind of military force. Now, you might say, well, so sad, but that is not America's issue. First of all, it is, tragically enough, America's issue for a few reasons. One, because the United States, that world war we were talking about, grew out of what might seem like a nonsensical dispute over the area that is today Bosnia-Herzegovina and Serbia. These small things blow up into big things.
It's not so much whether it's a sad thing. The question is, does Europe lack any military projection capability because we pay all the bills? So the idea is we get out so they can actually get strong and handle their own stuff.
Yeah. Now, that is an interesting point, because you could say, well, perhaps it is America's military guarantee that has helped these countries say, well, we'll spend a little bit more on social welfare. I think there are a few ways you can approach that. One that may, that is a political question that can be kind of complicated, but I have a few thoughts on it. One, I think it is worth remembering that, again, the countries that today comprise NATO have been, with the exception of Japan on the other side of the world, the countries that have caused the most military deaths and caused the most military aggression against the United States throughout its history. Germany, Britain, all these countries that have, Italy, these countries that previously had been America's enemies are today America's allies and add to America's ability to act in the world rather than limit it, attack it, and so on. So that's one consideration, that even if you are right, that this causes them to be somewhat weaker than they would otherwise be, it is worth recognizing that in exchange for perhaps the fraction of a percent of GDP extra that we spend on defense to quote-unquote subsidize their military, we have effectively neutralized, in a military sense, America's most deadliest historical enemies, apart from, of course, ourselves. So that's one thing. Another point is, I don't think that's necessarily true, that the United States is the reason why they don't spend more on their military. It is worth noting that many of these countries, again, to go back to World War II, had a very tragic history with militarism, and they feel like militarism generally is a problem. And finally, it is worth noting that these countries also are indeed independent countries. Europe is not the kind of union that the United States is, and one of the reasons NATO is so important is that I believe, and I think there's a lot of proof to this, that it makes European integration, free trade, open borders, whatever you think of the European Union, those are good things from a libertarian perspective. It makes that possible by making conflict between these states unthinkable. And that helps America, who's been drawn into those conflicts more than once.
Peter, final word on this issue.
I think the notion that the EU is good from a libertarian perspective is
not the EU, open borders and free trade.
Debatable. The EU is a fortress. It explicitly uses trade against other countries. It charges Norway. Now it wants to charge UK for access. It is a protectionist island, besides which it is a socialist superstate. There's lots of problems with the EU. If you're arguing that NATO enables the EU, I'd say that's a minus for it.
We're talking today to a room full of people who Go ahead, let it out. We're talking to a room today of people who I believe would call themselves mostly anti-war. Should it bother Americans, people who are here today for LibertyCon, that Raytheon, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, Bay are having some of their best years or best months in years when it comes to the prospect of NATO expansion? Should that bother people who are concerned about the military-industrial complex?
I don't think so. I think these are private American corporations. They're making money selling products to willing buyers and sellers, and I don't think that should make anybody angry any more than the fact that gun companies make a lot of money now and then should make people angry. The question is, what do the people who purchase the weapons do with the weapons? What will the Swedes and the Finns do with the weapons they buy from Raytheon? Will they be putting those to use killing children in Ukraine? No. What they will be doing is using those weapons to deter aggression against their own countries. The fact that Americans are making money on this, that they are helping subsidize our defense industry, is only an added plus. The same way that we wouldn't fault a gun company for a gun death in this country, we shouldn't fault a defense contractor for a death abroad. That's an entirely separate question. If you accept that morality, I think that people in here who believe in the Second Amendment, as I do, have a lot of complex, difficult questions they've got to answer.
If defense contractors are selling to other countries, yeah, sure, it's a business like any other. I think the question here, though, I think the reason why their stock has done so well and why their profits are so excellent is because of U.S. military purchases, both for donations to various countries and perhaps in preparation for further conflict, whether it be with China or Russia, all of which, of course, we choose. We are not forced into any of these, no more than Switzerland is. That is obviously a concern. Our country is going bankrupt very quickly. Our inflation, the economy is in a... we have the entire usual suspects of economic problems. This is not the time to be engaging in massive additional spending. The $10 billion that goes to a country like Ukraine could obviously be spent domestically. It could be spent on our cities or fentanyl or the border. There are many other priorities that, to me, rank higher than who owns Donbass.
Yeah, I think I appreciate the framing because, I do recognize there are scarce resources, and I think it is worth recognizing that, yeah, the money that comes from the American taxpayer that goes to purchase weapons that go to Ukraine could be spent on something else. I think anybody can recognize that. The same way that President Eisenhower recognized that every dollar that goes from feeding somebody and is put into weapons or ships or tanks is ultimately a tragedy. I recognize that. I recognize how grave these issues are and indeed how tragic some of the implications are. My point is not that I offer a perfect world or utopian solution, but I believe that that $10 billion or the amount that I believe so far, $54 billion the United States has contributed to Ukraine in its defense in total, that money is far better spent in that and trying to prevent a greater conflict by defanging Russian aggression than what we would have to, I argue, deal with in the counter, deal with as an alternative, a future war of greater scope by a hostile revanchist power that has licked hot blood and decided it can take more.
And this is the standard line every single time there's any kind of conflict and, the warmongers want to get us into it. You're, of course, not a warmonger. You're reasoned observer, is the domino theory. So always Putin's going to march to France. He's going to be bathing his feet in, in the ports of Morocco. I mean, whatever, right? These fantasies. He is bogged down in one of the most dysfunctional countries in Europe, one of the poorest, one of the most dysfunctionals, yes, one of the most corrupt, whether or not you believe they're democratic. He's having a lot of trouble right next to home. There is no way he's going to France. This is pure fantasy. Beyond which, of course, to the extent that he does have domestic support, this is because the regions that he's, in his mind, liberating are ethnic Russian. This is not going to carry over when he invades Belgium. So this is pure fantasy. This is trying to take a molehill and inflate it so that you can justify yet more military adventures.
See, I don't think that's a fair characterization because it relies on the fact that the Russians have failed so far in Ukraine to do anything more than take the territory that they've taken so far. A huge reason for that is because the United States, after the Russian annexation of Crimea, which happened in 2014, after that, the Ukrainian military, which had been able to put up no resistance and indeed decided the prospects were so hopeless it really wouldn't even try, the United States took an active role in partnership with some of its NATO allies to arm Ukraine, to help train Ukraine, and through its assistance, the United States and its allies have helped Ukraine. Of course, the Ukrainians' grit and mettle has been far and away the most important element, but we have given them many of the material means to resist, to feel like that resistance is possible. They have shown it can be done, but they have shown it can be done with American arms and arms material from our NATO allies, and that is a huge reason why the Russians have been stopped. To say, though, that they would have been stopped no matter what, and really the whole affair proves that this stuff is unnecessary, begs the question of how the Ukrainians made so much progress. And they made that progress since 2014 thanks to active engagement by America and its NATO allies.
And once again, Europeans are welcome to engage in those activities. Germany and the UK and France have lots of soldiers. They have lots of equipment. If they want to fortify Ukraine or whatever country's next on their wish list, Moldova, go ahead and do it. Absolutely. It has nothing to do with us.
Warren, I wanted to just point out, you mentioned support of Ukraine as NATO allies. As far as I'm concerned, they're not NATO allies, so we just kind of did it anyways. So don't we get involved regardless?
No, to be clear, I said that with our NATO allies, we helped Ukraine. I wasn't saying that they were a NATO ally. To respond to that point, though, the idea that we would do it regardless, I mean, it is fair to say that the United States on its own, individually, believes its own national interest is served by faraway adventurism. I mean, certainly the event that I think we would all agree was a disaster from many points of view, Iraq, was something that was primarily American-led despite the objections of many core NATO members like Germany, France. We had... the whole nonsense of the idea of old Europe versus new Europe from the Rumsfeld years. And these were countries that were trying to warn us, don't do this stuff, hold back. But the United States is often a country not inclined to hold back, for better or worse. By contrast, when the United States works in multilateral organizations, like, for example, NATO, it has to convince, oftentimes, allies that are skeptical of this sort of thing, like it did, for example, in Bosnia. The Italians and the Greeks were very skeptical of American and then NATO involvement there. But eventually, we were able to scale down the mission and scale up the peacekeeping side of it in line with our NATO allies, and we got a much more successful outcome than the maelstrom that was and tragically remains in Iraq. So that's a point that is worth remembering. If you think that the United States is only involved in the world because of these international organizations, the international organizations, I believe, temper the worst of American access, but also bring out the best of American statesmanship by calling us into a more natural role as kind of a neutral sort of arbiter in terms of viewpoint, but not neutral in the sense of thinking we can just kind of shield ourselves from the affairs of the world and let everything blow over, which just historically has not been the case.
No, they are tripwires. All of them are tripwires. They're intended to be tripwires. Korea, Japan, NATO, all of these are tripwires so that we can be forced to engage in military conflict. Why? Because it's profitable for people who are interested in this. When you say in America's interests, who exactly is the America you mean? Is that a family of 4 in Tulsa, Oklahoma? It's in their interest
Yeah.
who owns Donbass?
It is. It is
No.
in their interest because those are the people
irrelevant
who
to them.
will, if the Russians, for example, are able to engage in military conflict and bring a wider war into Europe. We know that the history of general conflict in Europe has always drawn Americans in.
Again
and
with
has
the
led
domino.
to
Again with the domino
you said
fantasy.
Again with the domino, and I get that because that theory was sometimes used in ways that were atrocious. For example, the idea that Vietnam was the linchpin of global affairs. But we're not talking about Vietnam. We're talking about Europe.
Talking about
where
Donbass.
we have Europe, where we have Eastern Europe in particular, where we have been drawn into conflicts that have been allowed to fester and eventually lead to countries bringing in the United States. Because the United States has always from the start insisted on its freedom of trade, freedom of navigation throughout the seas, and invariably some hostile Eurasian power decides, whether it be Germany or Japan, that that freedom is not ours to have. And
You
as a
are
result, we end up
confusing
having to defend it.
tripwires with dominoes. We set them up intentionally in order to pull us into conflicts. You see the conflict and you say, see, we should have gotten in earlier. No, we don't need to be in any of these countries. We don't need to be in Taiwan. I love Taiwan. I lived there for many years. I love the Taiwanese people. It ain't our problem. We cannot save the entire world. We no longer have the resources. In the 1950s, when we were half of world GDP, yeah, sure, we could goof around and play world policeman. We do not have the resources. These other countries we're protecting are eating our lunch because we go in, we do sanctions against China or against South Africa during apartheid. The Japanese, the Europeans, they come right in the back door, they laugh at us, they say, yeah, you guys go ahead and you confront them, we're just gonna go over here and make some side deals. We are getting played.
I don't know how you can say that with respect to South Africa. I mean, the sanctions on South Africa that were issued by the United States were late in coming, and ultimately they were not just the United States engaging in them. And if you're talking about backhanded dealing, I mean, again, the United States engaged in backhanded dealing. South Africa, too, was the Cold War. I mean, these issues are complex and subtle. The idea that the United States is the only responsible actor in the global system and everybody else cheats is nonsense. It is not true. It's not borne out by the facts. The United States is one nation among many, and the United States has found, out of an relatively enlightened self-interest, that active engagement in the world prevents more wars, prevents more death and destruction than is caused by isolating and trying to avoid. And we have learned that throughout the painful lessons of the 20th century, which, whatever you can say about the second half of it and time since then, has been far and away friendlier to American interests in terms of a freer world with freer trade, freer access for Americans to do business and take part, and less death and less suffering, less attacks, and less military dead here at home by the sacrifices of, like, the folks you mentioned, the family in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who had to give up their children to go fight the Japanese after they bombed Pearl Harbor.
Without getting into the intricacies of World War II, which I think fundamentally is just an extension of World War I, so that collapsed back into that. The question is, are all of those improvements in the world, right? Is the fact that we have relatively fewer wars and all of these things, are those furthered by these permanent engagements such as the debate question, which is NATO specifically? And I would argue that largely what's driven that, there have been a number of countries that have been interested in free exchange, right? China, for example, did discover that markets actually work. The Soviet Union did discover that reality exists, and it collapsed. There were many other factors that led to the outbreak of peace. I think that our placing delicate tripwires all over the world to make sure that we can get into conflicts whenever a Kuwait is invaded or some other random dictatorship gets into trouble. If we actually list out the conflicts that have occurred, the wars that the U.S. has been involved in since World War II, almost none of them fit the bill that you are describing. Rather, they fit what I'm describing, which is a series of tripwires, a series of opportunities. You have an entrepreneurial Department of Defense that goes out there and looks for enemies. If it can't find them, it makes them. It tries to push them into corners. You have lists of how we should counter China, people explicitly advocating that we do anything we can to weaken China. This is how you get a conflict. This is not how you get peace. The activism, the international involvement that we're doing today, I think overwhelmingly both makes the world less safe than it would otherwise be. It certainly makes us poorer and kills many of our boys that would not otherwise die.
I think that it's a strange claim to me to say that, given that, again, in terms of American dead, the total after the fundamental shift in American policy from isolation, unwilling involvement, to global engagement on a permanent basis, far fewer Americans have died. I mean, if we go with your 100,000 figure, That's 20% of that total prior to that engagement. I mean, so as a matter of pure numbers, more Americans are alive because of this process, unless you believe that there was something else that happened to change global relations and end great power conflict. But fundamentally, it is my position that it was American engagement in the world that made violence between other great powers almost unthinkable, and as a result has led to, while we don't have full peace, we do still have wars between smaller nations, far and away less destructive conflicts than we've had in the past. So that's one point. The second point, that it makes us poorer, I mean, again, I can say that's only that I don't see the basis for that claim at all. You mentioned, for example, earlier that the United States was once, I think, 25% of the, or maybe even half the global economy. I forget what it was. Right after World War II, of course, these countries, these other countries had engaged in some kind of almost suicidal destruction of themselves and one another, and as a result, the United States stood as the only country fully intact after the war that had been engaged in it. Well, the United States since then has, of course, continued to grow, but other countries have also grown as well. And that's a good thing. We want a more free, or rather a more prosperous world. I think that's a key to a more free world. But nevertheless, it is worth recognizing that the United States is not poorer than it was at the time. It has been able to contribute more resources to defense as a smaller share of its overall economy, and that has helped keep the United States from what I would argue is the alternative of having to spend more in these kind of rushed efforts that we've dealt with in the past to deal with aggression when we've tried to ignore it and hide from it.
Peter, please respond, then we're going to move to closing statements.
We are richer today because we still have significant private sector, container shipping, telecommunications, internet. There's a number of reasons we're richer today. If you take everything that's good today and you put that, I guess in this case, on NATO, that's silly.
But Peter, who protects the global shipping? Who protects those cables? Who protects those wires? Who is it who has made sure that there is no piracy, no threat to international commerce in the world today?
The same that have always policed pirates. The countries that are engaged in the actual trade go out and they manage their own trade routes. Individual countries through reciprocity. So, for example, if China is going to close down one chunk of water, we close down our ports to their ships. These are easily solved throughout history without having to put a global security umbrella and go intervene in every Rwanda or every random country that gets into trouble.
Tragically, we didn't intervene in Rwanda, and the genocide went on unquestioned, unstopped, until it burned itself out.
Gentlemen, we need to close this portion of the debate. We're going to move to 1-minute closing statements. You may begin. Peter, please feel free to close us out.
I am impressed that Warren came out to defend this point of view. It strikes me as completely insane. NATO buys us more war. It is destroying our democracy. It is gutting us, is hollowing us out and killing our boys. Yes, give them a little bit of notice because the Europeans need some time to learn how to walk, but get out as soon as possible.
Folks.
Warren?
I cannot imagine a position, with respect, more insane than to say that the United States should abrogate some of the greatest achievements diplomatically of its history, such as bringing together many of its former rivals and enemies into one same team to advance the project of, I would argue, international freedom. I cannot imagine a position more insane than that, again, with respect. Now, beyond that, it is really worth noting, though, that what we are talking about is not the choice between perfect and between good and bad, between better and worse. I acknowledge, as again President Eisenhower did, that the expenditures on the military come at the expense of you and me, the taxpayer, and they are, in a very real way, an infringement on our freedom. My argument is simply that the alternative is far greater infringement on our freedom at the hands of foreign powers, at the hands of our own government trying to respond to the aggression of foreign powers, and at the hands of dealing with a world dominated by other countries that are authoritarian in nature instead of a world where the United States is the most powerful player in the international system. Its allies are on the same team in Europe, and where together, the two of us can help protect a freer world, preserve our democracies, preserve the free trade and the international order, and in response, in the final analysis, the end result is a freer world for each of us as individuals and fewer deaths from conflict by the citizens of our country. I mean, that's what government is supposed to do in the final analysis. Unless you're an anarchist, government's first and foremost purpose is the protection of our physical security and the security of our property. Collective security does that today at less cost to the taxpayer, less cost to freedom, and in the process, it does so in the service of a great cause, democracy itself.
Yeah. Applause for our debaters this morning. Thank you so much for starting your day with us at the NATO debate. Warren, I don't know if you saw the sticker wall outside, but I think anarchists are in the majority here at LibertyCon. So, all right.